So to this end, we will have a really creative and distinguished panel to talk about how art and creativity can help illuminate thinking about the outbreak of a 21st century global conflict. This project is employing various forms of crowdsourcing to generate content, and today's event is in fact a capstone of what we have called a War Art Challenge that the project issued last November, and the project used the centenary year of the beginning of World War I as its backdrop and elicited fictional front-page dispatches covering the outbreak of the next great power conflict from any and all who had the nerve and inspiration to submit a piece. Many did, and the submissions were extremely impressive. They exceeded our expectations of what this experiment would generate in terms of trying to change thinking about the future of warfare. The project director, August Cole, wrote in a very incisive essay that culminated the contest. I'll quote him. "Remember when the next war started? Now you do. If we were to describe one of the main missions of the Council's Art of Future, it would be using stories to create those remember when moments about events that have yet to happen, about characters who have yet to change the course of history, places that will be marked forever as the spot where stone and steel met to spark a global conflagration, or the information void into which we will peer, seeking any sign at all that the human catastrophe of the next great war might be averted." So to help us engage this next great war question and reflect on the contest submissions, we're really pleased to have assembled this very thoughtful panel. Jim Stavridis, a retired U.S. Navy admiral and former colleague of mine, is the dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University and a former Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. No stranger to these issues, and also a member of the Council's Board of Directors. Ryan Evans is the editor-in-chief of what I would consider a must-read online salon, War on the Rocks. They have partnered with us in this endeavor, and I really want to thank Ryan and War on the Rocks for this partnership, which is just beginning to really take off. Siobhan Gorman is a former intelligence reporter with the Wall Street Journal and now a director at the communications consultancy Brunswick Group. We first met at another fictional event that the Atlanta Council convened, Cyber 912 scenario, a couple of years ago. Nice to see you again. We just had the Cyber 912 Student Challenge.
Oh, wonderful.
And Saturday, last week. So we're still doing that. And then certainly not last but not least, Nikolas Katsimpras, whose entry entitled Coffee, Wi-Fi, and the Moon was judged best in the field. He's a senior fellow at the Hellenic American Leadership Council, a lecturer at Columbia University, and also has a connection to the Atlanta Council as one of our young Atlanticists who we all went to the Wales Summit inside the perimeter and had a lot of really interesting discussions about transatlantic security with NATO and alliance member officials. Thanks for coming down for this. Those of you who've read Nick's story will know that one impetus for the conflict it describes involves the hacking in 2019 of a certain Russian president's pacemaker. And in case there are some of you out there who find this premise far-fetched, I wanted you to know that it so happens that our cyber statecraft initiative here at the Scowcroft Center is tomorrow launching a report. These reports are now available. It examines the risks and rewards related to networked healthcare devices, such as the real-world incident recently of an insulin pump that was manipulated across the internet. I'm sure no surprise there. We would have loved to have had the project director, August Cole, here for this event, but he is also fittingly otherwise engaged discussing the same topic outside of Washington this weekend. He was at South by Southwest in Austin. I hear that's a cool place. He's talking about a next great war alongside another Scowcroft senior fellow, Dave Anthony. Dave Anthony, the writer and director of Call of Duty, the video game series, was here October 1st, 2014, on this very topic, talking about fiction. He showed a video. Both his talk and his video are online on the council's website, and I'd definitely commend it. So today, August is at a publishing event promoting his forthcoming novel written with Peter Singer called Ghost Fleet, which is a futuristic look at what might happen if a brewing Cold War with China and Russia turned hot. In August's stead, however, I have asked Steve Grundman, the MA and George Lund Fellow for Emerging Defense Challenges in the Scowcroft Center, to help guide the proceedings. Steve is the architect of this effort, and I give him huge kudos for instigating and for overseeing this very important project. And so with that, I am getting off the stage, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the conversation.
Okay. I am to take the reins of this interesting discussion, and I'll start by saying that broadly we have three purposes over the time period between now and 5 o'clock. One is to recognize and give some exposure to the best of the entries in this War Art Challenge that we received. And indeed, after mentioning 4 of them, I'm going to invite Nick to actually read a set of excerpts from his story. We will assume that most of you have not read all of these stories, and you don't need to have in order to enjoy the conversation, because the second purpose is to take up the content of these visions of a next great war, or at least the instigation of them, either from the stories themselves or from the minds of our distinguished panel here. And then the third is to pick at the kind of enduring purpose of this project, the underlying purpose of this project, which is to figure out if art, if creativity, gives us some leverage, us in the traditionalist world of thinking about the future of warfare, if art gives us some leverage on these problems which we otherwise can't get. The hypothesis of this whole project is not only yes, but affirm, enthusiastically yes, it can. And I, at least in my observation of the entries that we got from this War Art Challenge, am affirmed in that hypothesis, at least for the time being. You can judge for yourselves. A couple administrative notes. This entire event is public and on the record. We are live streaming it over our website. So if, and I will come to an opportunity within the last half hour of the event to take questions from the audience. If I call on you, please wait for a member of our staff to bring the microphone to you. Carefully identify yourself and your affiliation before asking your question. Point one. Second administrative note is that we are tweeting the event over the hashtag #ACFutureWar. Indeed, I can receive questions for the panel by that channel, which our staff, if they're good questions, will bring over to me to consider. Finally, please note we are going to end not later than 5 o'clock. So as we approach that deadline, please shape and pace your questions as we try and wring out the last few questions that are in the audience for the panel. I'd appreciate that. Okay, so just a reference to the other stories before I ask Nick to read from his. There is a story here that we thought well of, Tallinn is Burning, by Sidney Friedberg. Sidney, many of you in this room would know, is the deputy editor at breakingdefense.com. Tallinn is Burning is a story which, I will do injustice to these, and there are copies of each of these documents I'm holding up out on the counter there. Tallinn is Burning, it suffices to say, is a great power, is the instigation of a great power conflict that is set in Tallinn, where no less than U.S. ground forces come into conflict with an enemy there. News enhancement in an info overloaded age by the alias Hip Bone Gamer. This is a fantastically creative piece about, in some sense, I should ask Siobhan to comment upon it, the overwhelming difficulty of even news reporters to grasp and render knowledge about a conflict in an age of information overload. Fear Paralyzes Pacific as Army Major Awaits Hearing by Major Matt Cavanaugh, a U.S. Army strategist who is currently assigned as an assistant professor teaching military strategy at West Point. This is an inspired story, again, a true great power conflict, but somewhat maybe like 1914, instigated by the actions of a lone individual, this story here. Blind to Our War by Edward Osborne we don't know Edward's background, at least from what I'm reading here, and it suffices to say this is a story about set in no less than Canada and New Zealand, where sort of an environmental activist becomes the instigation for a great power conflict. Finally, Pacific Plunged into the Abyss by the alias Saku is indeed a story instigated by a satellite, U.S., actually a whole constellation of U.S. satellites being shot out of the sky by an enemy. So that gives you, those of you who haven't had a chance to wade through these, gives you a flavor of what these stories are about. I do now want to turn to Nick and ask him to read what we all who judged these, Ryan was among the judges, regarded as the most distinguished of a good solid collection of these stories. So again, the question, the challenge posed to everyone, we gave the contestants a set of material mostly from 1914, from the outset of the Great War that began in 1914, and asked them to use those materials as inspiration to imagine and then render a front page news story about a future great war conflict in the 21st century.
Okay.
Nick.
Thank you. First of all, I apologize because my voice hasn't been able to keep up with New York weather. So, having said that, this is supposed to be a fictional journalistic account. So that's also the sensationalistic a little bit element in the beginning and the end. Click, clack, ding. For more than 40 years, the vintage thumping sound of Dusty Underwood Olivetti and Remington typewriters filled once again the New York Gazette editorial room. Looking down the rows of desks, the gloomy floor is filled with the flickering light of hundreds of candles bouncing off the lifeless, pitch-black computer screens. Today is the 24th day of continuous blackouts in New York, Washington, D.C., Moscow, and hundreds more cities worldwide. It is considered to be only the beginning of a spiraling conflict. Who could have imagined, though, that the greatest escalation of the 21st century might have started with a single cup of coffee? On that fateful morning of May 4th, Russian President Vladimir Putin passed his entourage in front of Starbucks located at Ohodny Riot Street, just walking distance from Kremlin. Putin's fourth term could eventually have broken the 20-year presidency mark had he not died the minute he stepped foot inside the store. For the first time in weeks, new information has emerged, shedding light to the burning questions of what has transpired since. The initial estimations of the cause of death involved complications due to Putin's heart operation at the Moscow Cardiological Center in 2019, about a year after the elections. However, GRU, Russian main intelligence directorate, almost instantly accused the US of having interfered with Putin's pacemaker. President Putin's active lifestyle demanded an enhanced pacemaker that allowed his doctor to monitor his health from afar over the internet. Its manufacturer, Russian LSTM Cardio, has long vouched for the bulletproof security of its Wi-Fi-enabled pacemakers, which is why Putin selected the relatively small but local company. For Putin, this was a testament of faith in an effort to promote Russian engineering. According to confidential reports by top Russian officials, their intelligence community has been investigating 3 scenarios, all of which include the Wi-Fi capabilities of the implant. These scenarios refer to a long-known vulnerability of Wi-Fi-enabled pacemakers and the way they connect to wireless networks. The third scenario is the most probable one, according to experts, and includes Putin, doctor himself. LSTM Cardio claims that the security of its devices is impeccable and that every hacking incident in the past involved individuals breaching the strict security protocols. According to the Russian medical technology company, any new software application has to be approved by the medical security teams. Dr. Achurin, Putin's doctor, has been accused of being quite lax with such security protocols and frequently checking Mr. Putin's signs through his personal laptop. Had he failed to follow the appropriate security directions, his laptop would not have been a challenge for any skilled hacker. Dr. Achurin's laptop might have therefore been the Trojan horse into Putin's heart. In a political perfect storm, the demise of the Russian president came at a period of record high tensions between the US and Russia. Kremlin's plan to pursue their extensive operations of helium-3 has further deteriorating the US-Russian relations, which had already been in decline since the 2014 Crimea crisis. According to Russian newspaper Pravda, 2020 has been the year that Russia launches its industrial mining of helium-3 on the moon. Helium-3 is a rare, non-radioactive isotope of helium considered as the second-generation nuclear fusion fuel. US, Russia, China, and India have been racing to both build the first helium-3 nuclear plant as well as mining helium-3 from the moon. Despite its rarity on Earth, it is abundant on the lunar surface. As a result, for the past several years, tensions have been escalated due to the absence of an agreed international legal framework for economic exploitation of the moon. Different lunar areas contain different amounts of helium-3, transferring the geopolitical games of the past centuries onto the virgin surface of our satellite. Putin's Russian pride would have never accepted to be beaten to the moon by the US again, which is why he was adamant about Russia being the first to mine there. The alleged assassination of Vladimir Putin is considered as a direct attack to Russia and a threat to its #1 strategic priority. Instigated cyber rumors about US involvement in the hacking of the pacemaker spread like a digital wildfire, causing the collapse of the markets worldwide. US cyber black ops were extensively blamed for the attack, resulting into the colossal mobilization of the Russian hacking mechanism. Russia, having drawn experience from Stuxnet practices, had created a highly complex, undetectable web of viruses that remained dormant in the greater American system. The aging US infrastructure, the minimal oversight of the security systems of private energy companies, and the element of surprise caused a total systemic failure. Russians were led to believe that Putin's death was a sophisticated, undercover attack led by the CIA to freeze the moon mining operations. However, cybersecurity experts around the world, including the prominent Russia-based Kaspersky Labs, have been quite vocal about significant indications that Beijing was behind the pacemaker hacking and the extensive subsequent cyber instigation. Analysts now believe that this may have been China's stealthy checkmate to catalyze the downfall of US-EU-Russia dominance with a single move. Beijing might have indeed been successful in setting the gears in motion for Chinese yuan to monopolize international trading and currency reserves. At this point, the damage is incalculable. Markets around the world have experienced an unprecedented collapse. Amidst the cyber chaos, banking systems have fallen apart, with information of potentially billions of users leaked to crime organizations around the world. All ATM and credit card transactions have therefore been frozen. Considering the extent of the devastating impact of the cyber attacks, the Article 5 of NATO is expected to soon be invoked. Could this be the first time that cyber conflict escalated to the point of bringing humanity to a monumental military engagement? As the portable Remington punches these last words, the sun is setting in New York. Click. It is the end of May, and the last rays align with the metropolitan grid. Click. The famous spring Manhattan solstice fills the 6th floor of the Gazette with a motherly warm orange color. Clack. However, everyone is cold. Will the Starbucks crisis pick up where the Cuban Missile Crisis left off 80 years ago? Ding.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Nick's story is plainly original, but it was worth, I thought, reading because it actually picked up and employed many of the themes that actually were common to these stories. Certainly the use of cyber technologies, but also in my mind the interconnectedness of things, the chain of events that get spawned, ignited by small acts is one of the themes that I think recurs in most of the better of the submissions we got. Okay, so I'm now going to turn to the panel, each in turn, to give us some initial thoughts about this topic. Then I might probe on a couple things of interest to me particularly, and then we'll turn to the audience. So we'll start with Jim Stavridis, and besides the biography that Barry referenced, I wanted to pick out for each of our guests an item of special interest. So in the second paragraph, you'll note, I didn't know, that prior to his service as commander of Supreme Allied Commander and his entire career, or the latter part of his career, rather, Jim served as commander of the Navy's Deep Blue strategic and tactical think tank after the 9/11 Pentagon attacks. In this role, he focused on innovative solutions to complex problems, including soft power approaches and hospital ship operations. Jim, what are your thoughts on that?
Thanks a lot. First, I want to just broaden it beyond what we've talked about thus far, which is really the value of fiction in prediction about war. And I think that's interesting, and I'm sure we'll sort of unpackage that as we go along. I just want to begin by kind of making an uber statement that the study of literature is incredibly important, not just to predict the future, but I would argue even more importantly, to understand other cultures, to connect with them, and in that sense, actually prevent conflict. So when I was a commander at Southern Command and at U.S. European Command and at NATO, we generated reading lists for our forces, which included not only the nonfiction that we all love and read, history, biography, autobiography, geography, et cetera, but also novels. I mean, can you really understand Latin America without reading Gabriela Garcia Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude? Can you really understand what's happening in Europe today without reading superb fiction and poetry from World War I? So I think that's just worth framing as a broad item. Now, our subject today, of course, is a fascinating one, which is how art and literature, I think principally, can help us think about great power or great war. So I think it's worth considering, how do wars start? I mean, what are the, if you will, the categories of war beginning? And I think there are several. One is what I'll call the war of personal ambition. And I just finished reading a terrific novel called Constantinopolis about Mehmet, the great Ottoman Sultan, who decides, above all, he must conquer the city of Constantinople. And it's a terrific work of historical fiction that really unpackages the personal in how wars start. And wars do start for very personal reasons. Maybe less so as we go forward because of the ubiquity of knowledge and information, but still a very, I think, fundamental part of how war begins. Kind of related to that, I would say, are wars of revenge. Wars of revenge. So think the Trojan War, and think Menelaus going to recover his lost bride, Helen of Troy, and drags civilization into war. If you haven't read the Iliad in a while, go back and check it out. It's really, in some sense, about great power politics with this overlay of revenge and personality. I would say wars also start because of a desire for ethnic cleansing, and you can kind of package religious wars into that, I think. They tend to blend. Sometimes it's religion, sometimes it's ethnicity. But today, of course, the headlines are full of the Sunni-Shia conflict. They should be. It's conceivable, back to the predictive, that the Sunni-Shia conflict could draw even greater powers than Iran, Shia, and Saudi Arabia, Sunni, into war. Entirely conceivable. But we ought to be quite familiar with that in the Christian faith. We've seen that movie before, right? The Wars of the Reformation, which killed about a third of the population of Europe over the 30 Years' War, the 100 Years' War, depending on how you want to package it. And if you want a terrific novel about ethnic cleansing, try The Bridge over the Drina by Ivo Andrić, who won a Nobel Prize, the only Balkan writer ever to win the Nobel. And it's a terrific novel about both racial and ethnic cleansing over a period of centuries, and helps you understand how great power wars start. And of course, World War I, the spark was in the Balkans, as illuminated by Harlan Ullman's latest book. I think wars begin also because of what I'll broadly call bargaining failure, which is wars over resources, and that can be the really big ones. I think that's probably what led Japan into war with the United States at the beginning of World War II, was resources and then a failure to appropriately bargain as that kind of concludes. And then there are simple wars of geopolitics over geography, over territory. Here, the wars of Central America under the Mayans, I think, are very interesting to look at as wars begin. So as we want to think about predictive wars, those are some categories, and you can kind of match up literature and art to many of those. I'll conclude by throwing out 3 novels that I think really do a pretty good job of predictive art and war. And one is actually a series of novels, but I bet almost everybody in the room has read them. And they're in the realm of fantasy, and they're The Lord of the Rings by Tolkien, which brings together a lot of what we're talking about. We tend to mentally pick up the War of the Rings right in the middle, really. But it's interesting to pull the threads on how that war starts, and it brings in a lot of the elements of ethnic cleansing, of revenge, of personality, Sauron and his personal ambition, ideology. And so I think that kind of fiction, fantasy, has a role to play. And I know we'll talk about cyber, but Ender's Game, I think, gives us a sense of cyber war and how it can begin. So Lord of the Rings is the one I would mention there. The one I mentioned earlier, Constantinopolis, historical fiction, I think is very helpful to go back, look in a fictional context at what happened, because conversation can be imagined. Mehmet's conversations about his ambition to take the city of Constantinople can be imagined. Constantine, the emperor at that time, his love of his people and his city can be imagined. And it can illuminate how wars begin. And the last one I'll mention, because it's just such an iconic novel about war starting, is Red Storm Rising by Tom Clancy. The modern version of that, and I'll close with this,
please,
is the one that was alluded to at the podium a moment ago, and it's Peter Singer and August Cole's new book, Ghost Fleet, which I have read, and I think is a terrific book, a bit of homage to Tom Clancy, updated to 2025. Pretty good predictive fiction. Thanks.
Available, if I may, on his behalf, plug it, I think in June. I think the likes of Admiral Stavridis have a reader's copy, but I think for the rest of us, it would be available in June. Thank you. That's
Sure.
a terrific start to the conversation. Let me next turn to Siobhan, and the item to which was alluded that I'll just pull out here is that she, for a considerable period of time, the Wall Street Journal covered, right, cybersecurity, data and privacy issues, terrorism, and intelligence issues spanning no less than 16 spy agencies. So she's had a busy beat until recently, when she stepped out of reporting.
Still focusing on cyber
consultancy.
issues,
But start us with your thoughts on this topic.
Well, I thought I'd just talk a little bit about sort of what the dispatches show about what it would be like to cover the next sort of great war. Particularly the cyber components. I thought that it was interesting that most, if not all of the dispatches that were featured had some component of cyber war attached to them, which I think, as most military experts would tell you, is probably indeed the future of war, where you see some sort of cyber component to it. And I think that the cyber threat was captured pretty well in the dispatches. I mean, you're looking at attacks that are launched from afar. They're outside, but they reach into the United States. They're difficult to attribute, so you've got a lot of questions about who's really behind it, who's your adversary, and they're often asymmetric. So you can go after, anybody could go after the pacemaker, even though rumors were swirling that it was the United States, which just leads to confusion and difficulty on everyone's behalf, but certainly reporters who don't necessarily have the intelligence capabilities of the United States government and other governments to figure out what's going on. And so I thought that the dispatches really offered a creative window into what it would be like to cover, a true cyber war. And it was, in fact, eerie to read the opening paragraphs, because it reminded me of a story or set of stories that I worked on back in 2009 after being challenged repeatedly by my editors to come up with a cybersecurity story that was real. And I finally sort of happened upon the fact that at that time, a number of intelligence officials were increasingly alarmed that what they saw as Russian and Chinese, hackers or cyber spies were roaming around the U.S. electrical grid infrastructure, sort of the computerized infrastructure running the electrical grid, and were even leaving behind sort of little, the equivalent of cyber bombs that could be detonated later, not now, but later, if there were a conflict. And the only reassuring thing about that story was, well, we're not going to have a conflict anytime soon with China or Russia. And so Nick's story then took us into that sort of, that potential future conflict, which I thought was really interesting. And I think that his and the other dispatches also really highlighted a challenge for reporters and for, I think, the public more broadly of when will we know that the next great war has started? And Admiral Stavridis sort of alluded to some of the thematic indicators. But when you're in the moment trying to figure out what's going on, I think that what these dispatches show us and what sort of recent experience shows us is it's often very difficult to know what it is that you're getting into until you look way back. I mean, Nick's story really takes place, I think it's 24 days in, and he's got all this great detail. But, I mean, that would have been roughly a month into, the next Great War. I think that particularly if you're talking about cyber components of a conflict, it's very hard, as we've seen with what has already gone on in, say, the electrical grid, to discern surveillance from attack, because the only difference is really intent of your adversary. If they want to run around and see what's going on in your system and maybe sort of do some contingency planning for future use, well, is that surveillance or is that attack? The difference is if they decide, okay, we're in a conflict now, then all of a sudden the very same tools can be used to attack the system. And that can be very hard until you see a physical impact, which may not be immediately. I think that the dispatches also just point to the difficulty of understanding the nature of an attack at the outset. The fact that he was, stationing his story outside of a Starbucks, I mean, that sort of shows kind of the globe as a battlefield, which can very much be true if cyber means are a method of attack. And I think that, you see this in terms of just compounding the difficulty that reporters and the public have in understanding conflicts, and particularly cyber conflicts at this point. If you combine that with sort of the flurry of information that you have, one of the other dispatches that was alluded to talked much more about the information overload, but I think that it's important to understand that given kind of the deluge of information that comes across now through the internet and any other source of media, it can be very difficult for reporters amid a conflict, particularly one that is being launched on the internet, to be able to discern fact from fiction. In fact, I mean, we've seen this happen over and over again. There are lots of rumors that will go around on Twitter, and reporters will spend hours just trying to figure out, is this a rumor? Is this real now? I witnessed Baghdadi, the head of ISIS, being killed several times over on Twitter. And you've got to go and you've got to check it out, and then you kind of go back to your job. But you can certainly see amid a cyber attack or some of these really complex things that are imagined in the dispatches, it being even more difficult to discern. And I think that just as a final thought, it may be that if you do have the next great conflict taking out the electric grid and we're kind of back to our Remington typewriters, it may well be that it forces journalists to focus a little bit more because you're sort of, all of a sudden you have no information overload because you don't have that kind of access. And in fact, you've got to go out and do sort of more traditional reporting and sourcing mechanisms, which at the very least might sort of pull away some of the fog of reporting that you get with a lot of the up-to-minute kind of reports these days. So with that, I'll pass it along.
Okay, that's terrific. Thank you. So finally, again, just to introduce the conversation, I turn to Ryan. Ryan, the editor-in-chief of War on the Rocks, who interestingly, prior to becoming the editor-in-chief of War on the Rocks, was deployed to Helmand Province, Afghanistan from 2010 to 2011, but that's not the interesting part. As a social scientist that was part of the U.S. Army Human Terrain System, OPCON to the British-led Task Force Helmand. Who knew? Go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to thank August and Steve and Barry for this great partnership between the Art of Future Warfare Project and War on the Rocks. It's been a really wonderful experience. When we speak at think tanks, we're usually making it all up, so it's great to be actually talking about fiction where that's encouraged. So it takes a lot of pressure off of me. It's also great to be sharing a stage with Admiral Stavridis. Back when we launched War on the Rocks in July 2013, I sent him an email, said we're launching this site. We'd really love for you to contribute, and he has supported us from the beginning. He wrote our first article. It was a book review on the first day, so it's great to be finally sharing a stage. So thank you. Mm-hmm. This has been a really interesting project to watch develop. Fiction is actually how I first learned about war, and I think if you think about it, that's probably how you first learned about war too, whether you're talking about watching cartoons as a kid, starting to read books and novels. For me, the most I learned from war was from books like Catch-22, some of the work of Graham Greene, Kurt Vonnegut, who sometimes very much a futurist. It was all science fiction, but very profound. And I think that fiction's actually invaluable to understanding war because most of us will never experience it, and it provides a very powerful window into the confusion, the terror, the dark humor of war and the camaraderie. And that's what's been great about this project. And watching all the submissions roll in, it was very interesting to see how they touched on a lot of the same themes. In addition, you know, a lot of the winning entries obviously focused on Great Power War because this was about the start of the next Great War. But there was also this sort of undercurrent of apocalyptic thinking. There was a lot that touched on Jerusalem as a focal point for events kicking off that also combined drones and cyber and in a very interesting way. And it was a fascinating window for me to see how normal people out there are grappling with all these new technologies colliding with all these old passions, tensions, and hatreds. And it's also very useful because analysts are generally terrible at prediction. I mean, there's been study after study on this that shows that subject matter experts actually get it wrong more than the average population does in predicting what's going to happen. And so for that reason alone, I think fiction becomes this sort of invaluable tool to forcing us out of our Washington bubble, out of our bureaucratic bubble, to think about war in a fresh and exciting way, maybe even a more scary way, but in a way that hopefully leaves us more prepared, or at least as more critical thinkers. The Art of War blog on War on the Rocks is exploring this in a lot of exciting ways with the Scowcroft Center and the Atlantic Council. Tomorrow we're actually posting there's this new wine bar in town called Sona. It's in Eastern Market, and they have this amazing mural on their wall. It's huge. It's bigger than, as big as this wall, and it's a bunch of grapes fighting hops. In this war, there's artillery, there's trebuchets, there's aerial support. It's very intense and really intricate and actually pretty amazing. And so we're going to be posting that tomorrow on the site and running another contest on who do you think is winning this fight, and write in 500 words or less. So all you military tacticians out there, armchair or otherwise, please chime in. And I'm just really excited to see how this project continues to develop. And I do want to make a plug for the War on the Rocks crowdfunding campaign. I'd be remiss if I didn't. We're going to be funding a huge expansion. We're going to be redesigning the site, doing a lot more exciting stuff with multimedia, really competing with the larger publications out there that you all read. And so we'd really appreciate your support. And I'm also going to plug August's book, August and Peter's book. I'm one of the thousands of people in Washington that seems to have gotten a review copy, and it's actually very good. And yeah, I'll leave it at that, so thank you.
Okay, let me, although each of you in different ways has perhaps begun to answer this question, but I certainly wanted to draw it out starkly, and that is, what about these dispatches, or again, your own thinking about the future of warfare, what is really new, really novel? What is revealed by these stories or other visions of the future that's actually not something we remember from the 20th century? And actually, what aspects of it were familiar, the fundamental things of interstate conflict or conflict more generally apply? Do you want to?
I'll start. I think it's cyber. The fact that it's so difficult to attribute in cyber, and a number of people touched on that. Mm-hmm. I think that we've always talked about the fog of war. It's impenetrable in the cyber world at this time. Mm-hmm. So I think a great deal of technology and imagination needs to be applied to solving that problem. Because if we can't understand from whence an attack comes, how do we generate a coherent, strategic, and dare I say it, a legal response? Mm-hmm. So I'll throw that one out there as something that's profoundly different, and that's something that I think fiction and art can explore for us.
Yeah, if I may, the concept info war, which it isn't so much in current use as it was maybe 10 years ago, that kept coming to me through all these stories. Information war, actual war about the knowledge and the reality of what's being reported or sensed was interesting to me.
Yet, and I want to pick up a point that Siobhan made, which is what's an attack? And this goes back to attribution. It's the second element. It's not only who is attacking you, but is it an attack when your data is completely wiped out? Is it an attack when your chips no longer work? Is it an attack when your transportation grid goes down and 300 airplanes crash? You know, we could have an argument about some of those. Some of those are extremely obvious. The one that just came up, of course, is the Sony picture hack. called a hack by North Korea, yet that caused $300 million in kinetic damage
Right.
to servers and probably another $300 million in business goodwill. I'd call that an attack, not just a hack, but that's another element of this cyber piece.
It's new. It's
That's
new
new.
in the 21st century.
And new even in the development of the cyber threat. I mean, we've heard intelligence officials saying for a long time destructive attacks are coming. It's not just about cyber theft. But I think that what we saw in 2011 with Saudi Aramco and some other attacks in South Korea, and then most recently with Sony, is sort of an increasing pace of these destructive attacks. And it was interesting, actually, with the Sony hack, and then I'll get back to answering your question, that everybody focused on the fact that they stole the CEO's emails, which was obviously a big deal. But what I would think most companies and governments and perhaps even some individuals should be alarmed by was the destruction of the data on the computers. I mean, if that happens to a bank, the bank goes down. If that happens to a stock exchange goes down. So, you know, that's the one thing is embarrassing, the other is completely debilitating. And just to pick up on your question and what Admiral Stavridis was saying was that I think that the means by which war was being executed in these dispatches is, decidedly futuristic, although playing off of the trajectory that we're seeing now, especially in terms of cyber. The adversaries are sort of back to the future. I mean, we're talking mostly China and Russia and other state actors. I think that maybe one of the dispatches alluded to cyber terrorism, but these were not sort of the types of threats that we're reading about today in the newspapers. And so I just thought that it was interesting that, particularly if we're talking about the next great war, the context was still being viewed through sort of traditional state-on-state conflict.
Yeah, that was, to my reading, a surprising consistency among some of the better
And it's also true of the
dispatches.
cyber threat. I mean, when you talk about sort of key threats in cyberspace right now, generally we're talking about state-based actors.
Nick?
Yeah, so one of the things, I had the perspective of also having been engaged with the material itself, and then having seen how other people
Right.
were able to take it from their perspective. And there were different, I would say, common denominators that for me, I see them popping up. And one had to do with the tipping point. Most of the entries had to do with a threshold, like a tipping point being reached, and then you have the spiraling of the conflict. And first of all, when it comes to conflict itself, this sort of spiraling, how conflict is able to emerge and then go from system to system and expand, it's something that's very typical, which is what what Admiral Stavridis actually elaborated very extensively, going all the way back to the Ellen of Troy.
I did that because you're Greek.
I know. I found that was great. But at the same time, now our hyperconnectivity has changed this transmission speed has kicked it into lightning speed. So this expansion, this viral expansion of conflict is what has really changed the past few years. And what was very interesting for me to read, even before engaging with the material itself, was the global risk report of the World Economic Forum 2 years ago, when cyber resilience was the key topic that they analyzed, and how our interconnectivity, this hyperconnectivity that we have established, all this, organically developed, it has the paradox of being a great liability in itself, but also putting us at the forefront of, for the first time ever, being able to tackle some of the most complex challenges that we face as humanity. So there's the challenge that we both can fail because of this increased complexity, but at the same time, we are at the point that we can, for example, cure cancer. We weren't able to do that before. So hyperconnectivity is on the downside of something that we have been experiencing, which actually is an evolution for humanity. And this is what we need to address. But to the point of how creativity also, and especially War on the Rocks is excellent resource because it sort of helps us move out of the groupthink that most of us find ourselves getting stuck reading similar perspectives, is the fact that the only way we can tackle this kind of complexity is thinking outside the box, figuring out ways of how can we tackle non-linear, and Mr. Pavel used actually the word non-linear. These are non-linear challenges. We cannot address them through linear ways. And the structures we have in place are linear. The transactions, the way we have been dealing with them are in a linear way. But the last part I want to mention is the challenge in changing fundamentally our behavior vis-a-vis these challenges has to do with behavior itself. We need to change attitudes on an individual level. And that was also what I was trying to portray with the great role of the doctor himself, of how his behavior was able to initiate something that's much bigger than him. And when it comes to security, when it comes to safety, it comes down to the individual unit that we need to adapt our individual behaviors in order to prevent those escalations. It's so much different than how it was like 40 years ago, 30 years ago. The role of the individual now is much more critical in a cultural perspective, and we need to focus more on the culture part of this as well.
The Scowcroft Center's Strategic Foresight Initiative, among other things, among its several themes about what's different in the future is this concept of the super-empowered individual. Mm-hmm. Who knew that might be a Muscovite cardiologist? Ryan, you want to pick up the what's new
Sure.
or what's
well, maybe
familiar?
I'll since I'm last, the best thing for me to do tactically here is to disagree. So I'm just
there you go. Thank you.
Well, I think it's important to recognize what is very new about cyber, and a lot of it is new. It's also important to recognize what's old about it. Is what we're essentially looking at is sabotage, intrusion, theft, on a much grander scale, obviously, because so many different aspects of our society are more vulnerable to these things in ways that they weren't before. And attribution is very difficult. And so this adds a new layer of complexity and new elements of it. But some of it is very old. And we are used to dealing with things. I mean, World War I is a case study of unintended second and third order effects and these massive mobilization chains that got out of control. The sort of ideas behind that problem aren't fundamentally different to what we might face with a major cyber attack. The domain that it's taking place in is different, and there are other different aspects to it. But let's not, and not that anyone was suggesting this, but cast aside all the lessons we learned from strategic history and think, well, this is an entirely new thing. Let's wipe the slate clean. But yeah, that's all I have.
Can I add
Please.
one thought, which is so much of the conversation tends to circle around the United States getting in a war with somebody, as though that's the only kind of great power war. Think a war in 20 or 30 years between India and Pakistan. I mean, that's like 2 billion people engaged in a war with nuclear weapons over an enormous land space area. Is that a great war? Hell yes. Mm-hmm. Think about, well, I won't give any other, and that's not a prediction, but I think we need to just expand the aperture from the typical, hey, who's the United States going to get in a war with? Because there are many other great powers out there. Good book on that. Not exactly a novel, but it certainly reads like one, is The Next 100 Years by George Friedman, very famous, well-known to most, where he predicts some pretty amazing wars by the end of the century. And he would say that's analysis, not fiction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to pick up on this chain of causation, if I can caption it that way, idea that Nick was alluding to. And I will admit that it's conceivable we channeled many of the submissions in this direction by offering them among the backdrop pieces, excerpts from Barbara Tuchman's history of World War I, which of course is an account that makes significance out of that. But where I wanted to go with this question is to the question of how to perhaps, if there is any insight from these submissions, or again, your own original thinking about it, how to avert a great power conflict. Certainly one of the ideas that I thought about was, again, is there a way to interrupt these inadvertent, uninformed, confused chain of what turn into malevolent events that are often not by design? Is that or some other insight from these a key to how we might think about averting great power conflict in the 20th century? Why don't we give?
Why don't we
give Ryan, take the cue from Ryan to
I don't
start
have
at that
anything
end
to
of the
say yet.
table. Now you're on the spot, buddy.
No, I think it's a great question. I really wish I had something clever to say. I'm going to punt.
Fair. Okay, Nick.
Yeah, actually, I would like more stakeholder engagement. So far, when it comes to policy, when it comes to decision-making at large, we see this top-down approach, and in many cases, we see this neglect of what's going on the ground, what the mid-management thinks, what different stakeholders outside the political sphere have to say about what's going on. And this is, for me, a big liability, especially when it comes to complex challenges like cyber challenges. We need to engage, identify and engage more streamlined methods in order to engage with more the business world, the technology world, like a civic society, and figure out ways of how the system of governance of the future looks like, instead of the rigid, frameworks that we have currently in place.
Don't just consign the problem to the diplomats and the lawyers.
You make it easy for me.
Well, but it seems like the diplomats and the lawyers haven't quite gotten their arms around it either. And
By the way, that was warriors, not lawyers.
Oh,
We certainly don't want to consign it to the
I
lawyers.
was like, lawyers, really? Oh, okay. I mean, there are lots of legal issues.
Excuse me.
But at any rate, what's interesting actually about the issues that you raise is I think that one of the drivers of the diplomatic discussion, particularly in the cyber arena, has been, can they create norms for certain behaviors in cyberspace to at least keep certain types of activities off limits, or create processes to try to avert misunderstandings from snowballing into something else, because there is a higher probability of that happening in the cyber arena because of the attribution and sort of the fuzziness of the tactic. But I think that one thing that we have seen so far is that it's incredibly difficult to establish these types of norms. I mean, certainly U.S. and other diplomats have been working at this for years and years, and I don't think that we're all that close to coming up with some sort of agreed upon framework.
I would say it's worth going back and looking at how other great wars have started, and so closely examining World War I, World War II, in fact, 20th century war. What's common? And I think one thing that's common is that in 20th century security, we tried to protect ourselves by building walls. Maginot Line, Schlieffen Plan, bamboo curtain, iron curtain, everywhere walls. How'd that work out for us? 70 million dead between 1914 and 1945. 70 million dead. Walls are not particularly effective, my view, in creating security from big events like this. They have some tactical purposes here and there, but broadly speaking, we shouldn't be worrying so much about trying to build walls. We should try and build bridges. So I think in practical terms, that means leveraging social networks. It means interagency cooperation, government to government. It means more open communication. It means private-public cooperation, which Nick alluded to. Wherever you can build bridges and open understanding and increase transparency, you are taking down walls. And I think walls tend to create wars, not the other way around. So that's one point. And then the second point would be to take us back to literature. And if you want a deterrent to a really big war, read the literature of the apocalypse. What would the world look like after a really big war? Look at what's called sometimes dystopian literature. Utopian literature, of course, is about how the world will turn out wonderfully. Dystopian literature is how it looks after a war. So go read Cormac McCarthy's The Road, or see the movie. Read On the Beach, about the world in a post-nuclear world by Neville Shute. Look at National Book Award nominee, out currently, Station 11 by Emily St. John, which is the world after a pandemic. Or go watch Mad Max in the Thunderdome. Point being, in all seriousness, the more we can imagine the terror of living in a post-Great War world with nuclear weapons, with massive cyber, I think that's a deterrent for us in a certain sense. So there's two ideas.
Nick, did
I
you
would
want
like to add something, because Dean Stavridis remind me of, for me, something that's critical, and how the silos we have built in all these years of vertical specialization, or all these years of focusing on our individual territory, are a liability now. And this transition to horizontal collaboration, deep collaboration, is something that, for example, the technology field, the medical field, have embraced for the past several years. And one of the most popular talks that I've been giving last year has to do with Microsoft, Google, different technology companies. How could they enhance their capacity of breaking down silos and engage individuals and teams through this cross-functional collaboration model? And when it comes to Actually, Microsoft had this really interesting, they have a center in Boston called the New England Research Development Center, NERD Center, which is, I thought it was hysterical. And they were talking about how it takes so long for government, for all the rigid structures in place to catch up with the cultural component of what's going on out there, for example, in technology, of how they have embraced innovation and how the work, even though technology has made leaps forward, the way we work together as teams is still in the 50s. And they have been moving towards that direction when it comes to policy, governance at large. We are still so far behind in embracing the importance of cross-functional collaboration and the liabilities in place because of it.
Okay, finally, and then, all right, so maybe I won't add. I'll tack my question on at the end, since there's a pent-up interest here. Harlan, who indeed has written, and last year published a book on that was at least using the impetus, the start of World War I as its impetus, is the first I'd like to ask to weigh in here. Harlan Ullman.
Thank you, and thank the panel for a really interesting toward the horizon. Very simple question. If you could give the next president of the United States one piece of advice that he or she may not have gleaned from your incursion into future war, what might that be? And I include you, Steve, as well.
Panelists?
I think we've already broken the mule's nose beating it so hard, but it's cyber. We are woefully unprepared for this, and despite, and I agree that with Ryan that in the present tense, cyber has not killed anybody. It's not damaged anything beyond a few $100 million. But I would say very shortly, the ability to go after chips, we know that can happen now with an EMP burst. Not exactly cyber, but a cyber effect can absolutely bring the world to its knees. We're not ready for that at all. We don't have a cyber force. We have a very convoluted, siloed approach to how we deal with it as a government. I would put enormous emphasis on preparing for cyber.
And I would say a consistent one, because I think one of the things that we've seen in terms of just sort of the policy discussion is with cyber, it's kind of come and gone. It's almost like an every other year phenomenon, and that I think is at least one reason why it's been difficult to really push policy forward on that front. And there are many, many reasons why that's happened. But I mean, cyber legislation has been under discussion for a good 5 or 6 years, and each year it sort of gets a little less ambitious and still doesn't make it through. And I think that sort of, keeping a steady push on some of these huge issues where the policy is woefully behind is one piece of it. And then sort of the corollary piece is to be aware of the minimal role that government really plays in all of this. And I don't mean to point out the obvious of so much of the cyber threat residing in the private sector, but that is a very difficult structural problem. And the fact that the government doesn't actually have control of the situation, it does point to the limitations, even once they do kind of push policy forward, of the government actually being able to fix this. It's not going to be a military fix. It's not going to be a policy fix. It really does have to be more of a societal addressing of the problem.
I have a comment more, like it's more like 50,000 feet, more not as technical. It has to do with empathy across space and time. And what I mean by this is decisions work in a non-linear world, and decision makers often neglect this non-linearity, meaning that we are currently paying the price of unintended consequences of decisions in the past, and we will pay the unintended consequences of current decisions in the future. And having this awareness right in the center of decision making, I think it's critical in order to avoid making the same mistakes over and over.
I'm going to give 2 answers, and the first is going to sound glib, but it's not, is that to work with Congress to figure out a normal appropriations and budgeting process, because I think, but I think without that, the rest of this stuff becomes sort of a second-order concern because we won't be able to address these other things. But on the more substantive side, it's about figuring out what deterrence means with not just cyber, but with ambiguous and hybrid warfare, and how that is going to inform moments of crisis. And I think Ukraine is going to be a great case study moving forward on that for good reasons and bad reasons, but that would be. And I don't have any answers on what deterrence is going to mean. I just know that we don't have the answer yet.
I think in these dispatches, I'll be brief, the the thing that struck me the most was, again, this sort of chain of causation, this rapid fire chain of sometimes unintended events. So I guess my advice would be find and build, or at least create a capability to build firewalls in your national command, you know, your NCA decision-making processes. It's a little abstract, but firewalls against being being tyrannized by information and events that compel you to make choices. Somehow create space, design in the way you perhaps undertake war games or other things. Think about creating what I'm calling fire breaks, excuse me, not firewalls, fire breaks in the chain of information and decision making. There, you asked me, so I had to get in.
Yes, I'm Randall Fort with Raytheon. Given that we're looking 10 years ahead, I guess my question is, are you really being creative and speculative and really stretching the boundaries enough? 2025 is between $500 million and $1 billion-fold more per Moore's law cycle progression. So all the things we're looking at today, directed energy at kilowatts will be megawatts, which will be very different. Autonomous systems will be really smart and autonomous and maybe at nanoscale. There will be maybe 1 trillion objects around the world connected with the Internet of Things. The virtual reality, virtual physical convergence will be 10 years further down the road, and so on and so on. So you talked about nonlinearity, but it's exponentiality. So, are you really being creative and you know, daring enough in how you're thinking about the future?
Nick?
Yeah. Actually, no. And the reason is, I specifically in this context, in the piece I was writing, I was trying to strike a balance between the technical aspect and my limited knowledge of some of the finer nuances of it. So again, I wouldn't want to be refrained by that. But in the end, this is also goes back to what I was saying before. The only way to approach this, we need engagement of the different stakeholders who grasp the different aspects of this nonlinearity. And currently, there's no communication. There are no bridges between the different stakeholders, both vertically and horizontally, throughout the globe, and also when it comes to different power structures. So the only way to actually have something that makes sense in what you just asked would be to figure out what's the right form of engagement to bring such people together, identify them, and empower them in order to address the challenge. Otherwise, we will have what we had in the past, which is piecemeal approach from specific lenses, specific disciplines, which in the end, everything that comes up will not translate in this uniform emergent solution. It will be just tackling individual aspects of the complexity.
Yeah. I'm not sure who you're addressing, as in, are you thinking aggressively enough? But I think what we're talking about today is literature and art. Are they aggressively looking creatively? And the answer is yes. If you mean these 5 or 6 submissions that I saw, probably not. But if you really look at the literature of science fiction, you look at what's happening in art, you look at what's happening in writing, I think absolutely. All the things you mentioned, I think are actually commonplace. I think the real changes over the next 10 years are going to be in bio. They're going to be human performance enhancement, human life extension, sequencing the human genome for almost no money. Those are the things that are really going to impact, and I see a lot written about that. So I think it's out there in the literature. And if you mean, however, this particular collection probably didn't push hard enough, but I think the borders are really being pushed, particularly in science fiction.
By the way, one of the perhaps most worrisome things about the submissions we got is that most of them were scenarios that play out in the next 5 years, and we did not guide that. We could have, the submissions we got were open through the century, and the visions of a next great war that we got from 10 or 12 were all within the next 5 or 6 years.
Just jump in on that real
Please.
quick, and just to piggyback on the Admiral's point, I mean, if you look at the cyberpunk literature of the 80s, it's one example of how this very much predicted a lot of the stuff that's just starting to happen now. And even the terminology we use, I mean, that's where cyber comes from. But this is why I sort of have an uneasy relationship with futurism, though, is because we tend to focus on what's this state going to be doing in the next 100 years, who's going to be the great power. We don't know how technological change is going to influence geopolitics too far into the future, and so we're sort of guessing at a certain point. If you look at, if Lockheed's pretty revolutionary energy projects come to fruition that's going to dramatically change the global energy landscape? And how is that going to affect relations between great powers? It's a really hard question, but those things that we can start to answer and that I would encourage futurists to look more at, and this is where they can learn lessons from artists and people and novelists, is how is it going to change what warfare looks like? How is it going to change how two states go to war, whatever those states might be? Whether or not Mexico or Poland are going to be great powers in the future is sort of less useful for us to play with now than what war is going to look like when that exponential growth does happen in directed energy weapons, for example. So,
Okay, I'll take a question right here in the second row, and then we'll make our way around.
Hi, excellent discussion. Matt Horn, I have a question sort of to come back to reality here for me. You know, we're sitting at the Atlantic Council and we're discussing cyber and nano and in the context of fiction. But how do you look at cyber and nano and these issues in the context of NATO? At what point does a cyber attack or a nano attack or an exponential attack or EMPs, you know, at what point does it cross the threshold for an Article 5 intervention if somebody perpetrates this against one of the 28 NATO members? Thanks.
If only we had a former...
Yeah.
Not that I'm...
No, I'll be glad to swing at that ball. So you know your NATO treaty, maybe everyone does not. Article 5 is bedrock in the treaty. It's a fairly simple article that, in summary, says an attack on one will be regarded as an attack on all. What's interesting is Article 6, which is what defines an attack. And it was written, of course, when the treaty was written. And it says an attack will be construed, I'm summarizing here, as people, material, on land, sea, or air. Those are the definitions. So under the treaty, a cyber attack in the discussion we're having would be difficult to articulate unless there's kinetic damage as a result of it. So this is a very lively conversation in NATO, and I think it should be. We're not going to revise the NATO treaty, I don't think. But the idea of cyber and a definition of attack, which I think Siobhan alluded to earlier, I think needs to be hammered out now. And I wrote a piece in Signal magazine, you can take a look at it, defining a cyber attack. I think it does center around kinetic, but there are broader implications for it as well. Bottom line, an Article 4 conversation could be brought in front of the Council, the North Atlantic Council, and I think would be if there were a massive cyber attack against, say, Estonia by a nation to its east.
Mm-hmm. We have about 15 minutes left, and there are 6 or 7 hands that have come up, and I'd like to move at a pace that gets through those 6 or 7 questions, if we could, starting right here, this gentleman.
Hello, my name is Jan Siitä, and I'm a visiting fellow from Finland and work in a think tank called CTR. My question is very simple. I come from a country which still has general conscription.
Yep.
So each male has to do the military service. How do you see professional military in terms of future conflicts? Is it a loyal partner or an actual threat for society?
Reformulate the very end of your question one more time, please.
Yeah, the professional military, is it a threat for the society itself, or is it
Moving away from conscription is what he means.
Yes.
I see, okay.
Yeah.
Please.
I hate to hog all the answers.
There's a social scientist.
No, okay.
Not a military sociologist.
I think professional militaries, which are non-conscript, reduce the chances of great wars and reduce, in general, the chances of war. And it's a complicated question. You can spin that argument and say that a conscripted force, which brings everybody in, puts more societal skin in the game. But I would argue over time a professionalized force is one that is more controllable, one that has more professionalism in it, hence the term, and I think is one that is more less likely to have the unintended consequence that leads you off to war. It's a debate. I know the Finnish armed forces extremely well. They are utterly competent. It works for Finland in the context of Finnish society. I think as a construct within NATO, conscription, as you know, has diminished significantly, and I think that's probably the macro trend in other than very homogenous nations like Finland.
Mm-hmm. I think there was a question on this side of the room which I had otherwise been overlooking. Maybe not. Okay, right there on the aisle, please.
Hi, Rob Levinson, Bloomberg Government. You know, there's a lot of reason for we can all get very pessimistic, and like you said, Great War is going to happen in the next 5 years or something like this. I'm just curious if any of you, there's a professor at another prestigious Massachusetts university, Steven Pinker, who's written, you know, the Better Angels of Our Nature, points out since that 1945 conflagration, things have actually been getting a lot better. And despite all the technological advancement, we're killing each other and committing violence a lot less among one another. Do you see things changing permanently? Nick, I think you alluded to some of this too, that maybe we are implementing those mechanisms, building those bridges, and we're getting a lot better at this thing.
I'm not sure that's a question. I agree with it as a statement, but I'd certainly open it up, obviously.
I take a much more pessimistic view. I mean, I'm very familiar with Pinker's book. We've actually, on War on the Rocks, we published a lot of essays reacting to it. I particularly recommend Frank Hoffman's stuff on this. People were making a lot of the same arguments right before World War I. And I guess the counter-argument that I would make is I hope he's right, but all it takes is one big event to make him very wrong. And it also, that argument, and a lot of people that piggyback on that argument to then say, see, the world's not so dangerous and everything's going fine, don't sometimes fail to appreciate the extent to which American power and the American-led international order and working with its allies, and how much this peaceful, relatively peaceful environment we see is a deliberate product of that. And how saying, well, everything's fine, maybe we don't need to spend so much on defense, maybe we don't need forward presence, maybe we don't need this and that, actually undermines those pillars on which that peaceful, this relatively peaceful order that we see is built.
Question here, please.
Really interesting panel. I'm Aaron Manis. I work at the University of Maryland, and I work at a computer lab, so all this talk of cyber is really interesting, but there are other things, other big trends going on in the world. I'm curious if any of them played in. Two that are on my mind is there's a band of countries in water-critical states across Middle East and Central Asia. There's also the demographic cliff, maybe implosion, facing a lot of advanced westernized countries. I'm curious if these things played in. Thanks.
I'd add one, yes, again, back to, is it playing out broadly in the literature and the dialogue? Yes, both water scarcity, which the World Economic Forum has put at the very top of its security watch this year. And of course, demographics are destiny. And so, yeah, those two are playing. I'll add another, which is pandemics. We dodged a bullet on Ebola. That bullet's going to come around again. Go back to 1918, the Spanish influenza infected 20% of the population of the world with a mortality rate over 50%. Put that on today's adjusted population basis, you've got hundreds of millions of people dead. Is that possible? Absolutely. So there are other macro things to worry about, and I think those are in the conversation, and they ought to be.
Not prominent in the selection that we sampled, as it turns out.
One brief thing also in the nonfiction world is Admiral Stavridis is also very familiar with. I mean, the intelligence agencies regularly put out their predictions for sort of the global trends that they say. I think it's called global trends, 25 years out from wherever it is. And the last one, certainly featured the resource issues around water, population shifts, certainly pandemics, also, climate change and things like that. So anything that is changing sort of the relative powers and resources is potentially going to lead to conflict.
Can I add something? Because the World Economic Forum also mentioned a couple of years ago, which goes back into these years, the danger of the drug-resistant bacteria to antibiotics, and how there's this sort of like race between viruses, bacteria being mutating at a pace that our medical capacity is unable to keep up with it. So this, they call it a hubris, meaning that we reach that's a term that they were using. So if you were to combine that with our hyper connectivity and what Stavridis mentioned, I think it's a very novel way of seeing threat and the mutation of the threat.
I will suggest, because it actually in part was an important inspiration for this project, if you're familiar with the movie or the book by Max Brooks, World War Z.
Yeah.
if you allow yourself to watch that movie and think of and put pandemic on the zombies, it's a very compelling rendering of a really scary pandemic.
It is, and it's
and the government responses to it. It's a very sophisticated movie, actually.
yeah, it's a better book, but it's
Fair enough.
but it's not a terrible movie. Yeah.
And Max Brooks, by the way, is going to be the judge of a war art contest we're running this summer that will ask contestants to render their work in graphic novel form. By the way, Brian?
Just the zombie genre in general, not just that movie, but 28 Days Later, there's a lot of them are really actually great at depicting just how fragile our societies are in many ways.
Yeah. Okay, right here, this gentleman.
Very much. Two quick questions.
1 second, please take the microphone.
Oh, thank you. Admiral Stavridis referred to the two great wars of the 20th century, maybe the most violent century in human history. And one of the lessons learned from the 20th century was the importance of collective security, which Admiral Stavridis and others have played such a prominent role in. In the response to your question about how to avert the next war, where would you put the concept of maintaining, improving, continuing to use effectively collective security? And a second related question is, after World War II, another very new dramatic development, maybe somewhat like cyber today, was nuclear weapons. And our American strategists developed the strategy of deterrence with nuclear weapons. Again, back to the question of how to avert the next war, how do you see the role of nuclear weapons together with collective security in helping to prevent another great war? Thank you.
Actually, I have a spin on that as well I'd like to direct to you in a second.
I'll take it.
Please.
Collective security, absolutely. NATO bridge. Building bridges, 28 nations. NATO also has partnerships beyond the 28 allies as part of the Partnership for Peace program. That continues apace. We need to do that in a way that doesn't threaten Russia, for example. And Russia, by the way, is a member of the Partnership for Peace program, or was until recently. So I think building bridges is the right answer. In terms of nuclear weapons, they're going to continue to be kind of this Death Star Galactica that orbits above us. And in a certain sense, as they did during the Cold War, I think they'll prevent or help prevent, because to unleash them would be so mutually destructive, as the term goes. What's interesting to consider is whether we need a deterrent regime in cyber over time. And I think that conversation is starting now.
That's the extension on his question I wanted to ask, is whether we should think about and act on the realization that cyber is the next this generation's as it were nuclear weapons, and we need a whole scheme of strategy, law, and other
policy
regime around it, akin to what we built over 20 years from 1945 from nuclear weapons.
Well, I think that it's an important point, and it's interesting to me that people have been talking about deterrence in cyberspace now for many, many years, and there's been so little engagement outside of the U.S. government on it, and part of it is that the U.S. government has been very uncomfortable talking about it. In fact, the first time I saw sort of a prominent person in the U.S. government talking about it was Eric Rosenbach, the senior DOD official, gave a really interesting talk at CSIS, but this was like maybe a year or so ago, and he was talking about one of the big points he made was that in order to deter, you actually have to talk about what the threat is. And there's been a lot of discomfort around that. I do think that given that at least the parameters, I think, are broadly understood by the public, there's a huge role for academia and a huge role probably for fiction and nonfiction writers as well. I mean, it doesn't need to be something that's really confined to, just a small group of people in the know. And the strategic thinking, I think, the more people who are sort of focused on that issue, the more likely they are to arrive at a solution, because so far the more insular approach has not really gotten us very far.
Another way to put that is, without Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we never would have had a nuclear deterrent regime. You had to demonstrate, and tragic as it was, of course, it not only ended the Second World War, but it gave visualization to what the end of the world would look like.
These apocalyptic. Did you want to get on this? We'll take one more question, and it's going to be right here.
Jasko Pára, Creation Master.
I'm sorry?
Croatian ambassador.
Oh,
Thank
nice.
you. Welcome.
Yeah.
Welcome.
So,
Nice to see you.
thank you for this luxurious discussion. Well, compared with the challenges we are meeting on a daily basis recently, so this is a sheer luxury. So, I have a couple of questions. One is in the age of globalization and ever-increasing interdependence, economic interdependence, information interdependence. So, who would be the parties of the Great War? Well, not in terms of which countries would be, but what ideas would be behind a great war, a conflict? And also, would such a conflict be winnable at all? And if it is, if the answer is not, what's the purpose of any conflict of that kind, a great war? Well, no doubt, our stupidity is capable of many wars, but a great war, is it possible? Is it winnable?
Mm-hmm. These exact conversations, as Ryan alluded to, these exact conversations were happening almost exactly 100 years ago. And go back and read the pre-World War I literature, which said exactly your point, that we're all interconnected. It's the fundamental implication of your point is it's impossible. We're never going to go to war. Unfortunately, never underestimate the propensity of the human race to find ways to enter conflict. So I would not write it off, but I think it's less likely. And back to the point we were making earlier, Ryan's correct, but I think as this gentleman says, I lean more toward Pinker's arguments. Just if you put them in the long throw and you look at where Europe was for the last 1,000 years, it was the epicenter of violence. I think it's unlikely we're going to see a big war come out of Europe again, for example. So we make progress sort of a step at a time, but I'm cautiously optimistic, but I don't discount the possibility of a real war.
So it's a good capstone question to go ahead and run the panel here, if I may. Nick, Ryan?
I think the part of your question that I latched onto was who would the actors be, and what's interesting now is there's so many. Well, but there's so many actors that could be involved in such a war now, more than ever before. So also how this combines the old and the new. Go back and read a history, I mean, many people in this room probably have, of the Russian Civil War. It's mind-boggling how many different actors were involved, non-Russian actors. I mean, if you take the Russian factions alone, that's really confusing. But even outside, mind-boggling, really confusing. Times that by 10 with how a global conflict would look like now, because now you have collectives and organizations and like Anonymous that can be involved in major ways that are everywhere in the world. So I think it could be it's a lot more. War has always been and always will be complex. Now it's just going to be even more complex.
Yeah, I also actually share the cautious optimism of Stavridis. At this point in history, the difference, I think, perhaps could be that we have the examples. We have 2 world wars recently under our belt in terms of visualizing what this dystopia could look like. Now, whether this could be a deterrent, I would like to think that it's it's a stronger deterrent than anything else out there. But at the same time, I want to always keep in mind that we have indeed been living the past 20 years in the post-Cold War era in the most peaceful period in humankind history. Now, the past few years, there has been a deterioration in the global peace index, absolutely. But this has to do with regional conflicts, internal conflicts. It's a different kind of lower body count conflict that we have been experiencing. But in terms of massive scale casualties what we were used to in the past, I would hope that this is something that, as a society, we evolve out of. So it's sort of like a fossil in the DNA of us getting stuck in this animalistic, like a self-destructive manner. Having said that, you never know what happens. Always we keep surprising ourselves of how evil can creep out of us.
Siobhan, do you want to break the tide of this utopianism here?
Well, I think that as we were just discussing sort of the lack of a sense of what's deterrence, particularly in cyberspace, if that ends up becoming a key venue for conflict, I think that the lack of deterrence means that at the very least you end up with sort of low-grade conflict for some extended period of time, because there's no reason not to have it, and some people feel that they have a way to gain advantage over somebody else, and the nature of cyber conflict sort of lending itself to asymmetric warfare means that the actors could literally be anybody. You know, the issue is, well, what would be the cause of a great conflict? And it may be that the likelihood of such a conflict is low, or lower, but I don't know that it's necessarily unlikely either, just especially if you, again, look at it through the lens of potential cyber warfare. The probability of misunderstanding or a lack of clarity around some sort of action in cyberspace is so much higher than through sort of traditional military means. And the mechanisms that we have right now are so nascent and not in a great position to necessarily tamp down misunderstandings, that you do have the potential there still for things to kind of spiral out of control, that even if we can sit here saying, you know, well, rational actors would not do this, well, if you have a chain reaction of misunderstandings, then, you know, there you are.
We are going to have to close. The question I was going to ask before I saw the enthusiastic hands in the audience was to come back on one of the purposes I'd said we had, which was to, you know, pick away at the question of whether arts and creativity really gave us some insights, could give us some insights that we otherwise wouldn't have about the future of warfare. And I think it suffices to say that if the exercise, the very modest exercise thus far that we ran, succeeded in stimulating this conversation and attracting this terrific audience to this discussion, I think that's at least some partial proof that it's working, that art can in fact help us understand and make sense of and plan for the future of warfare in a way that other approaches might not do. So I want to thank the panel very much, which I thought was terrific. If you could all join me there. I also want to encourage you to visit the website. It's not on the Atlantic Council website. This project runs its own website, artoffuturewarfare.org, where there is currently another war art challenge that we are running and which will culminate in May. It is Space Wars at the End of the Century is what that is trying to elicit. And then finally, there's a reception outside that I hope you all will join us to enjoy. Okay.